to this new episode of our show. Today we have the pleasure of having with us Brian Menell. He's a British South African businessman with over 25 years experience funding, developing and managing mining, energy, trading and agri-industry projects across Africa, Europe and the Americas. Brian today is the chairman and CEO of Techmet Limited, a leading metals investment company with a portfolio of assets that responsibly produce, process, and recycle the metals that we really need for building the global energy transition. He has basically huge in industry. He has worked with government as well. Maybe Brian.
Great to be with you.
So I mean, in front of me there is a very long bio that I kind of tried to summarize, but maybe you can add a little bit of color to what has been your, journey in business, Brian.
Sure. I come from a South African mining and metals family. So my family's been in mining for almost 100 years. I was involved in the family businesses up until our sale of all of our historical legacy family interests across base metals, precious metals, ferrous metals around Southern Africa in the early 2000s, since which time I've been involved through private vehicles in natural resource projects, largely around sub-Saharan Africa. More recently, in the context of Techmet over the last 8 years, more heavily weighted towards North America, South America, and Europe. So I now live, having been born and grown up in South Africa. Our main office is in London, so I'm primarily in Europe, though a lot of our businesses are in the US. So I'm in the US a certain amount of the time.
Excellent.
So, Brian, from your perspective, we saw a sort of development of globalization happen in the last, I would say, especially the last, 5+ years. Let's consider the coronavirus, geopolitical conflicts, now tariffs, and whatever else kind of globalization is maybe still present in a market perspective. But if we consider trade of goods, entire supply chain, something really happened in the last 5+ years, and maybe there's a regionalization trend. Can you comment that? What do you see from your perspective about it?
Certainly from the perspective of our industry, which is critical minerals and the critical minerals value chain, not just production, but processing, refining, recycling, and component manufacturing for batteries, electric vehicles, renewable energy systems, and the many other transformative technologies that our critical minerals are necessary to build. That reversal or that move away from globalization, where the drivers of consumer interest are primarily value and efficiency, to a much more segmented world where the drivers are security of supply and geopolitics in parallel with cost and hence competitiveness, has been quite dramatic. I mean, I don't know too much about other industries or global supply chains, but I think critical minerals has been particularly focused on in terms of the imperative of supply chain security and hence localization or regionalization.
And speaking of these kind of drivers that are, I guess, reshaping global, value chains and value chains in your industry, Francesco was alluding, of course, to the geopolitical context, but I guess there are also other factors, ESG factors, climate change. It is a mix of things that I guess is leading companies and industries to rethink the way they operate. Do you see these drivers being equally important, or do you recognize certain drivers being more important than others in the context of your industry?
There's certainly all of the drivers, or the balance across the different drivers are in evolution. And we do have various pendulum swings associated with certain of the drivers. When we talk to big US automakers, they say, we certainly want preferential access to your production of nickel and cobalt and lithium and rare earth metals, because we realize, the electrification of mobility requires totally different supply chains, and we have to have preferential access to it. And we want them to be competitively priced because we're in an existential, we have an existential threat of Chinese scale and incumbency in our industry, which is really difficult to compete with. So we can't afford to buy the inputs more expensively than we could buy from them or they're buying. However, we want transparent, well-governed supply chains with high ESG standards because we are consumer brands that are judged by the consumers for the integrity and standards of our business and how we manage our inputs, which is quite understandable and correct. And we want to be independent across our supply chains from leverage and control by our major competitors, i.e. China. And all of that has to be done efficiently and without us having to take undue financing risk in industries that we don't adequately understand in order to secure that preferential access to product and that standard across our supply chains. So those requirements in combination are impossible. They require trade-offs, and what trade-offs they are prepared and we're prepared as their suppliers to make varies. At the moment, there's a swing towards security of supply in the context of global trade disruption and tariff conflict or tariff regimes, and a swing away from ESG, which takes longer and costs more. Everybody wants transparency and everybody wants low carbon footprint, and everybody obviously wants to avoid PR risk of association with any element of the supply chain considered damaging to the environment or unethical with respect to labor or of origins that are associated with conflict. So that is the present direction of travel, is security, independence from China, and cost. Because our industry, or at least transformation of critical mineral supply chains, needs to balance China's overwhelmingly dominant position across all of our metals globally, but it also in terms of supply security, but also in terms of industrial competitiveness. Some sort of, without price competitive inputs, given the advantages China has in terms of 15 years of building capacity while everybody was sleeping, the US car industry, as it transitions to electric mobility, which it will, regardless of accelerations and decelerations short term as a result of regulatory support, it's a direction of travel that's inescapable and unstoppable, is the case in Europe. There won't be an auto industry. There won't be an auto industry in Europe without secure supply of battery metals. And that trumps ESG compliance without negating it, because obviously nobody, VW, nobody else wants to have vulnerability in the supply chains, but they have to have preferential access to product. They have to have inputs that are not dependent on China. They have to have competitively priced inputs. Otherwise, they're just going to in their home market.
And in the context of the ESG factors in your industry, do you see, for example, the E of the environment having more weight than social considerations, or they have like equal attention from stakeholders?
I think it's equally spread across environmental impact, social impact and interface, and governance from a point of view of transparency, being free of any taint with respect to corruption or conflict. In the case of products coming out of the Great Lakes region, which have been a significant element of fueling and paying for conflict, which has been, an enormous blot on elements of the supply chain. And a lot of that is driven by PRs, clearly. Nobody wants their products, which are clean, new tech products and new energy and new mobility products, to be tainted by anything that is not in accordance with those brands. And that's not just the auto industry. This is Apple. This is data centers for big tech. This is robotics facilitated by the next phase of AI. This is drones. This is everything that's dependent on our metal.
Thanks, Brian. From a close, let me say, business operations perspective, related to your industry, which are, let me say, the the topics really impacting global value chain? Also, which are the main drivers?
Yeah, I mean, I think those main drivers remain sort of cost, supply security, being not beholden to control or influenced by Chinese interests, and ESG. So the drivers remain the
That remain the
distribution
same.
across trade.
Yeah.
And the drivers are obviously very different in the US than Europe. Not very different, but there's a different weighting. There's more
But
of an
from
ESG.
a regulations perspective, you mean?
Yeah, from a regulatory point of view and from a consumer interest point of view. So I think
Okay.
European automakers are still placing more emphasis on ESG credentials of their supply chain than perhaps
All right.
American automakers as the
All right.
pendulum swings back and forth. If you look at defense tech, because all of
Yeah.
our products also go into defense technologies, which is a very rapidly evolving and sadly growing space in the context of Ukraine and other conflicts globally. That's totally different because defense companies are much more driven by security of supply than by price or ESG. And again,
Yeah.
having
Yeah.
supply that's not beholden to potential enemies.
Totally. And this opens to kind of the next related like questions, we have here about stakeholders, so which are in your perspective the most important like stakeholders in your industry. And I think you started already to mention some of them.
I think what's changed dramatically, I mean, I founded Techmet in 2017 when
Mm,
critical minerals supply chain security was somewhat of a novel story. It's
mm,
obviously become a much less novel story. And since then, there's been a massive shift from consumers of our products wanting driving the market in
mm,
terms of their volumes, their need for security of supply, their need for cost-efficient supply, to governments who have caught onto the enormous importance from a geopolitical and national security point of view of critical mineral supply chains. And hence a lot of what's happening now from a funding point of view, from a regulatory point of view, is driven by sovereign agencies and regulatory environments rather than by what VW, Ford, are thinking about their supply chains, because they're particularly confused at the moment because there's so much volatility and uncertainty in their industry. So government is coming to the fore as a funder and as a regulator and as an insurer of a landscape that counters China's control and builds supply to ensure industrial competitiveness and growth and jobs and national security.
Mhm.
Can we say, Brian, that of course minerals, materials, as you mentioned, are critical drivers to determine like new areas of influence all around the world. Also, in a developed scenario, especially consider a post-global perspective, with a U.S. roaring back a roll and facing China again, or maybe in a different wave, and so as you said, these like minerals and all the related, becoming a driver, as you said,
Yeah,
managed by governments to determine who controls area all around the world.
yeah. No,
I
no,
mean, I'm
it's
referring to
certainly.
Ukraine. Ukraine is a great case, I think.
Exactly. It's remarkable that, and again, a massive shift. I've been a miner or in the miners and metals industry all of my
Mm.
working life, and I'd become used to being unfashionable. Nobody wanted to talk to me. I didn't get opportunity to participate in podcasts like this. And the fact that this has become a
Yeah,
massive focus of attention is, big shift. And the
big
fact
change.
that critical minerals are now center stage, not only with respect to industrial policy to ensure national security and industrial competitiveness in Europe and the US and elsewhere, but in numerous global peace processes and diplomatic initiatives where critical minerals would never have been on the agenda. The fact that critical minerals are now center stage in the Ukraine peace process, the US engagement in Ukrainian security and
Yeah.
peace, center stage with respect to US sponsorship and engagement and support of the Congo DRC Rwanda peace process, center stage with respect to the rationale for the US aspirations in Greenland, is a big turnaround
Yeah.
very challenging and exciting one. I mean, we're involved in the Ukraine process, we're involved in the DRC Rwanda process, and the challenges are considerable, but the opportunities to add value to those peace processes through facilitating investment are considerable. Why would in the new brave world in which we're living,
Yeah.
for the US to be able to domestically justify ongoing cost and underwriting of security and stability in the Ukraine is massively added to by US participation in the strategic value and the economics of developing natural resources in the Ukraine, as is the case in the Eastern Congo.
Yes.
So we can now have the opportunity to play a role way beyond secure critical mineral supply chains in an arena that we haven't really been center stage in at all
Yeah.
historically, but now can really make a contribution to.
Very interesting. And Brian, as you know, we are coming into this conversation and not really from an economist perspective or a political science perspective, but from a business perspective. We kind of with this podcast, talking to different industry leaders and experts, we are trying to understand how businesses kind of reacting to this kind of fast changing environment. So I'm wondering if you maybe can share an example of a story of some kind of a value chain restructuring that you have seen happening in your sector, in your industry, businesses that do rethink the way they operate as a consequence of this kind of
Yeah.
fast changing place.
It's there's changes in our industry and in critical mineral supply chains everywhere, but of a very, very low base. Over the last 15 or even 20 years, while everybody was sleeping, China has been building an unassailably dominant position across the world with respect to control and development of primary resource, be it lithium in Australia and Argentina, or cobalt in the Congo, or nickel in Indonesia, and even more so with respect to specialty metal chemical processing at home in China to dominate the supply chains. And that's the recognition of the imperative of balancing China's overwhelmingly dominant position. And it is a remarkable achievement that's made a massive contribution to the world that one can't
Hmm.
in any way not respect. But nonetheless, it's now a major national security and geopolitical balance issue. And it has to be countered, and the recognition that it needs to be countered has grown massively. The question is what to do about it in Europe, what to do about it in the US, what to do about it in Japan and Korea and elsewhere. And that's very challenging. So what you need to do is what is happening today, which is balance China's control of primary resource by engaging much more actively as the US government in support of US aligned interests, and as European Union and European governments in support of supply chains feeding European industry with respect to primary production, be it in Argentina or the Congo or anywhere else. And even more importantly and more challenging, building processing capacity either in friendly jurisdictions, and it doesn't have to be at home, it could be in India or Saudi Arabia,
Yeah.
again, in order to balance China, because China now today controls between 60 and 95% of the global supply of all of our metals, or Techmet's metals, which is 7 key critical
It's a
minerals.
monopoly.
It's massive, and there's no quick fix or magic bullet to,
Mm.
but the efforts to do that in the hands of people like Techmet, with US government support, with European government support, with support from our other shareholders like the Qatari government through the QIA, and many others in our industry, accelerating. But it is very, very early days. So I don't have a case study of where everybody woke up to the fact that if you want a lithium hydroxide from hard rock spodumene to go into lithium-ion batteries in Hungary for VW in Germany, you need to build capacity to process spodumene outside of China in order to have security. And this is where it's done, and this is how it's done, and this is how we've succeeded in reducing Chinese control from 85%, 65%. We're not there yet. There are a lot of plans, there's a lot of government initiatives, there's a lot of elements of our industry, such as Techmet, dedicated and committed to transform our industry and these supply chains, but we're just at the beginning. of a long and very, very challenging journey.
No, so sounds to me we are as a West, in the early days. The question, I would ask like myself. I mean, maybe not here, but I would ask myself why we slept 30 years.
Yeah,
Why? Right? Right? What?
yeah.
How we landed here? Why?
Yeah.
Why we did that? Because it was clear the world would have landed in a, in that like in that stage, in that point. So why we did that? So
No, it's because we're lazy and weak.
as you as you intro
We need to
that,
become
In a
hardworking,
nutshell.
harder working and stronger and much more strategic and much more medium
yeah,
term driven and much more national and international strategically driven as the Chinese have been. And we need to, what led to the present situation is a
yeah,
culture in the 80s and 90s and early 2000s
Yeah.
where businesses were driven by short term, performance.
of course,
And short-term performance means that you're going to buy your inputs as little as possible, as late as possible, and as cheap,
Um,
at as low a cost as possible.
of course,
And that was China.
Let me ask you something. Sorry, on this, Brian. I guess also, inspired by the work of TechMet. I mean, do you think that this, evolution of globalization in the global context is also in a way creating a new conditions for public-private partnerships and, collaboration between government and industry?
Yeah, absolutely. And TechMet is a very good example of that. I created TechMet in 2017 for this very purpose, to help to catalyze the transformation of our industry as the energy transition accelerates and other transformative technologies needing these metals grow. And I did it as a China-free platform from inception in order to leverage what was totally obvious, to me at least, that countering China's control was going to become a massive political national security priority, and governments would have to engage with funding and regulatory support in order to move the dial in balancing China. And that's what we've done as TechMet. That's why we have direct equity investment from the US government, which nobody else has. That's why we have Qatari government. That's why we're busy with other governments at the project funding level with the Norwegian and Swedish governments co-investing with us in their rare earth separation plant in Norway. Brazilian sovereign funding agencies coming into our Brazilian nickel large-scale expansion. We're partnering in Cornish Lithium with UK government through the UK Wealth Fund, who put in equity and are doing more. So that's exactly why we did what we did in the form we did it. And the growth in public-private partnerships to transform critical mineral supply chain security, again, are just at the beginning, because we need $100 billion, not necessarily from governments, but governments need to de-risk and catalyze the scale of funding that we need from public and private sector sources in order to radically transform these global supply chains, not only in terms of independence from China, but in terms of volume and standards, all of which the world cannot do without over a 2, 5, 10, 15, 20-year horizon if we want a clean, sustainable, and secure and stable world.
oh
Yeah.
yeah, also, going to global supply chain perspective, I mean, you, of course, you anticipated there's a lot of geopolitics, there's a lot of, let me say, government initiative over the private one, because it's a critical, it's massive, it's really important, it's becoming top of the agenda, especially in the last years. So which are like critical factors if you imagine like the supply chain in the plan, source, make, deliver. Of course, it's not a common, it's not kind of the same company framework like we have, because it's a very specific industry, it's a very critical, so it's a different. But which are the factors if you imagine, the chain in a overall and global context today?
Yes, the key drivers of the transformation of our industry, or the key enabling factors to allow for the transformation of our industry, are money. So we need sources of capital that are efficiently priced so we can build competitive production. And that is in scarce supply. And it's not big in global context of oil industry or global pharma, but it's sizable. The Chinese have spent provided government funding support, certainly of well in excess of $100 billion for the building their dominant position across our metals over the last 10 years. And we need something of a similar order of magnitude to build our supply chains to supply growth and demand without shining control. And that needs to come, or at least certainly needs to be de-risked by sovereign funding agencies, because the private sector and large sources of private sector funding are not well suited to metals and mining. You know, they haven't been in metals and mining for a long time. If you go to the big pension funds in the US and in Europe, they realize the need for what we're doing and the imperative and the value creation opportunity, because we are at the beginning of a 20-year supply demand dislocation. So what we're doing, we create a lot of value. I mean, the last 7-8 years, we've created enormous value for our shareholders, and we'll continue to over the next 7-8 years. But despite that, the attitude is we don't really have the expertise to judge risk and value, because we haven't really focused on mining and metals for the last 20 years. And we think it's maybe a PR and ESG risk that we prefer not to take, because we don't quite understand it, even that we know that it can be well governed and there is a good side to your industry, and therefore generally best left to others. So until they're forced to, and from a regulatory point of view and a government risk-sharing point of view, we'll continue to be inadequately supported financially by equity markets, investors, and by big financial institutions. And that's a major problem. We then, once we've got money, we need to build projects. And that requires efficient licensing and regulatory environments, which again have become very moribund in Europe and the US, and require long periods of time and a lot of money to get permissions and permits to build things. And that again needs to be streamlined without compromising standards. Obviously, we don't want to build things badly in a way that's detrimental to health or environment or communities. But we don't want to be held ransom by minority interest groups who, in the context of Western democratic environments, can hold up projects for 10 or 15 years. So we need regulatory and government help to ensure that's not the case. Otherwise, we can't build supply chains. And we need regulatory help with duties and tariffs to protect markets and provide short-term protection while we build critical mass and competitiveness
and scale. Yeah, sure. Because otherwise, because you need to fill that gap that over like 30 years, of course.
And one other thing, we need innovation in order to do things differently in terms of process technologies and component manufacturing, because with all the best will in the world, even with full government agency support in Europe and the US, we can't out-Chinese the Chinese, because they're really, really good at it. So we need to do things differently to compete. So we need new processes, and that's a lot of what Techmet does, is scaling novel process technologies to build quicker and produce cheaper and cleaner than the Chinese, and compete without having to do what they do better than them, which we're not going to be able to do. They've got 15, 20-year head start.
Right. Brian, thanks for everything you shared. That is incredible, and it's not like an everyday content we have chance to read, so listen. So thank you for that. In your decade by decade experience all around the world, is there maybe a couple of experiences or things you did you are super proud of, and you can or you would share with us here?
Yeah, I mean, it's difficult to point. We as Techmet have 10 operating companies that we've funded and built or are building, expanding, or in late stage development across 7 metals and across 8 countries around North America, South America, Europe, and Africa. And I'm proud of all of them, because they're all scalable, world-class projects that can make big contributions to China-free, clean supply chains for US and European industry. And they all have big challenges, and they've all had their ups and downs in terms of technical, operational development, and in terms of funding, and in partnership at the asset project level and at the Techmet level. So my source of pride is Techmet as a platform rather than any one particular case study, to have created a diverse platform, have brought in equity investment from the US government, which nobody else has thus far achieved in our industry, other sovereign funding sources such as the QIA, who are very enterprising and big, but not easy. This is relatively novel structure and strategy for them as it is for others, having brought in big family offices like part of the Walton family in the US and other big European families. So I'm proud of having created that platform, which I believe is now scalable, and we can build billions of dollars of value and relevance to supply chain security, to clean supply chains, to national security in the US and amongst US economic allies.
And Brian, I would like to ask you one final question, and I guess this is where we try kind of to look at the future and not at the recent past. So you kind of clearly summarized the factors that are reshaping your industry. My question to you is, do you see kind of these factors remaining and kind of characterizing what is going to happen in your industry in the next 5, 7 years? Or do you see, for example, new drivers emerging that might be again driving change in the future
I think the themes that have started to dominate are ones that are going to continue to grow.
for a
And
while?
that national security, industrial protectionism, and industrial competitiveness to fuel growth and jobs, and hence political and social stability and security
Yeah.
in US, in Europe, elsewhere in the world. So those aren't going away. They're going to become more and more pressing imperatives every month, every year for the next 2 years, 5 years, 10 years. And likewise, the new global Cold War environment, which will be dominated between competition between Europe, between the US and her economic allies and China, will again not going anywhere. It's going to have its ups and downs, and it's going to have periods of stability and periods of conflict. But as a major theme of the global geopolitical, industrial, commercial landscape over the next 5, 10, 15 years,
Yeah.
20 years, it's not going away. I think what is changing is the landscape from a point of view of drivers of demand, from a point of view of technologies and innovations to transform supply. So on the demand side, since we created Techmet, we've talked a lot about the energy transition and the battery metals and rare earth metals you need for electric vehicles and wind turbines and solar cells. And that's not going away. Again, the
Mhm.
electrification of mobility, the move towards greater, the dominance of renewable energy sources and national grids is not reversible. It'll again have ups and downs, but it's a one-way street requiring a lot more metals. What was less talked about and will be much more talked about in the future is the critical minerals going into AI data centers,
Yeah.
the power infrastructure to support AI data centers in terms of renewable energy systems, batteries, but also the hardware in AI data centers, which are quite minor metal intensive.
Mm.
In the drivers of demand that arise out of the next generation of AI, which is going to have a massive effect on acceleration of humanoid robotics applications, drone applications, autonomous driving applications, all of which you need what we produce. So that's going to accelerate massively and could totally overshadow the EV
Yeah.
industry as a driver of growth and demand.
Exponential.
Even more so requires us to accelerate funding and innovation in our industry to meet that exponential growth and demand. Otherwise,
Yeah.
how we like to see the world in 10 years' time won't happen.
Yeah, absolutely. Brian, I guess we could probably keep talking with you for hours. This is super interesting.
Thank you.
But I guess this is a podcast, and unfortunately, we need to bring it to an end. But it was truly a pleasure to have you in our show. Thank you so much for your time, Brian, and
Thank you.
congratulations for all the good work and the good projects that you are developing around the world.
Great. No, thanks very much for having me. It's been a great pleasure.
Thank you for being with us.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to this episode. If you enjoyed this discussion, we invite you to like and share this episode on your social media. Enjoy the rest of your day.